Hello and welcome. My name is Warren Bain. I am the Education Supervisor here at the Shaw Festival in beautiful Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, Canada. I am joined by my colleagues, Matt Rattel, who is beside me doing tech, but you can't see him because he's beside me, and my colleague Nina Taylor, who's in the Zoom room with you. If this is the first time we are meeting, then welcome. We're happy that you're here. And if you recognize my face, then welcome back. We're excited that you're here with us as we launch our 2025 Community Engagement and Outreach season. Welcome to the Art of Ideas Conversations on the Inklings, the Oxford literary group comprised of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and Owen Barfield, and many more who elevated the genre of fantasy writing and narrative fiction. Tonight, or today, depending on where in the world and time zone you're in, we kick off the 2025 season at the Shaw Festival with a celebration of the 75th anniversary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And to celebrate and to discuss with us, we are happily joined by Dr. Monica Hilder and Dr. Stephen Dunning. Dr. Hilder is a professor of English at Trinity Western University, author of a 3-volume study of C.S. Lewis and gender, including The Feminine Ethos in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, of a fiction book on fairy tale, Letters to Annie, and co-editor of The Inklings and Culture. Dr. Dunning is a lifelong devotee of myths, fairy tales, and epic adventures. His imagination was stimulated and shaped by the Oxford Inklings, and he has taught young adult and fantasy literature for many years as a professor of English. He has a PhD in English literature from Cambridge University and now spends much of his time writing and publishing young adult fiction. They are both co-directors and co-founders of the Inklings Institute of Canada. This conversation is going to be in 2 parts. Part 1 will be a discussion with Monica and Stephen, and I'll try and be in the conversation as well. And part 2, we are going to open it up to you to ask questions and follow your curiosities about the Inklings together. So when you have a question, pop it in the chat box. Nina is going to be monitoring and gathering those questions for us. And so if we have a roster of them, we can launch right into the Q&A in part 2. And there's also a part 3. We'll give you a sneak peek into the Shaw Festival's production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe with our digital learning resource, our study guide, helped made by the Shaw Festival Education Department. So stay on after our conversation, and at 8 o'clock we'll launch into that study guide, and it's just lovely. So that's the introduction, but now welcome, Monica. Welcome, Stephen. We're so happy that you're here. And I wonder if we can just jump right into it. How did the Inklings form? For those of us who don't know the Inklings as much as you, and I think there's probably a lot of people on the planet who don't know the Inklings as much as you two, but how did the group form? What were the key factors in them getting together?
Friendship, mutual interests. Also connected with a student group at Oxford University that wanted professors to come. But yeah, Tolkien, Lewis, their friendship, their mutual interest in northernness. Stephen, add to this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you named Lewis and Tolkien. I think that's essential. In fact, I would argue that Lewis was the center of the group, and it was his nature to invite friends, and he was very convivial. And the group started really officially in 1933, and he would meet with friends in his rooms at Magdalen College, Oxford, or at the pub. It was called the Eagle and the Child, also known, Monica, as the Bird and the Baby.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, so
where both of us had been there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was basically about Lewis, and it lasted the better part of a decade and a half, really, the meetings, I would say. So it ran right through the Second World War. Yeah. So that's it. It's Lewis.
So the pub is still there. We could go to the pub tomorrow if we wanted.
And I've had a pint there, and I don't know, Monica, if you.
Yes, we have. Yeah, my family has. It's great. Go there for sure. That's not the only place. They also met across the street, the Lamb and Flag and other
Yeah,
places. But Eagle and Child is kind of it.
yeah,
And then also, as you were saying, Stephen, in Lewis's rooms. And yeah,
yeah.
I would concur with that, that without a Lewis, perhaps this group would not have had
Mhm.
the drive that it had. Yeah.
Mhm.
And what was the nature of their meetings? It seems to me like the pub. I mean, it seems like this group, but also theater, has a very long history in pub culture. There's always a good theater pub. Every theater has to have one. But it seems like the nature of a conversation in a pub is different than the nature of a conversation in somebody's study in Oxford.
Mm. It's an interesting point. Well, it depended. I mean, I think that some of the evenings involved alcohol, some involved just tea. So I think that the meetings in the rooms could have become quite lively. That's my sense as well.
Mhm.
But yes, and I
Yeah.
think and I think, well, Monica, what sense do you have of what they would do in the
Well,
meetings?
basically, I always think of them as just getting together and reading each other's manuscripts.
Hmm.
And Warney, Lewis's brother, saying this was actually really intimidating. And then, over time, one hears, oh my goodness, yeah, Tolkien did not like Lion Witch in the Wardrobe. And then it was Hugo Dyson. It's like, oh no, more elves, forget that.
I was actually going to add the
Yeah,
expletive that he put in there. You probably remember that. Hugo
yeah.
Dyson said at one time, "Oh no, not another effing elf," to
Yeah,
Tolkien. You know?
yeah, and that particular F word was omitted from Diana Patrick-Gleyer's book on it. But yeah, I know, right? And in her book, let me just mention that Diana Patrick-Gleyer's book, The Company They Keep, is a great resource to learn more about what it was like and so on. One of the things to really note about this is that they really, well, especially Lewis and a lot of them. Tolkien maybe in different ways too, but they actually were combative. They were very argumentative. The whole idea, academic discourse, basically take the
Mhm.
fencing metaphor. So what might be considered by some people very rude in our time, not a safe space.
Mhm.
Yeah, but they wanted that, but it
Mhm.
was also intimidating. So the responses to that. Um, Tolkien being, very dismissive of Lion Witch in the Wardrobe. Lewis was crushed. He may not have done it, but then we have Roger Lancelot Green saying, no, no, this is excellent. Tolkien
Mhm.
refused to read his stuff at some point if Hugo Dyson showed up, that kind of thing. Yeah,
I had no idea that Tolkien didn't really take to Lion Witch
Yeah,
in the Wardrobe.
yeah,
That's fascinating.
yeah.
yeah, no, he
Yeah.
thought it was a disaster.
Well, I think that Tolkien. There's something that we need to get on the table here
Yeah.
too. Is that Tolkien was a very methodical. He was a slow writer,
Mhm.
and it's interesting too. Lewis was very open to criticism. He was open to hearing things, but Tolkien either completely ignored any criticism that he got about his own work or rewrote it completely. So
Mhm.
he was,
Yeah.
and he was very slow. I mean, Lewis wrote all of the Narnia tales much more quickly than
Right.
Tolkien wrote the supposed sequel to The Hobbit.
Yeah.
But so I think that they were very different. Tolkien was meticulous about manuscripts. Lewis, on the other hand, lost people's manuscripts like he would, and so this was typical. But I think that the typical evening, it would have been people would get together, have a few refreshments, and someone would read something, and then they would hear what people thought about it. And I imagine, as Monica says, it could be a lot of back and forth, sometimes combative. I imagine there were a lot of jokes, and you can just imagine it was probably pretty funny. Yeah, I would have
Yeah, yeah,
loved to have been there.
yeah, that's really good. And just to tag on to that, the idea Tolkien is a self-described pedant, how he described himself. So very, as you were saying, very meticulous. So his take on The Lion Witch in the Wardrobe was that it's really a mishmash of classical myth and
Mhm.
Christmas. Like, what's that all doing together? And you haven't properly represented a faun. You've reduced it and so on.
Mhm.
And there's also the element. well, people conjecture that Tolkien was jealous because we might say, if we want to compare, Lewis like Mozart, it just pours out, and Tolkien like Beethoven, this is so hard. But of course, they were both brilliant, and they really did appreciate each other's
Mhm,
giftedness.
mhm,
So while Tolkien did not like Lion Witch in the Wardrobe, he loved Out of the Silent Planet, the first of that trilogy, and he was the one who pitched it to Alan Unwin and said, "You've got to look at this; it's great." And perhaps it would not have been published had it not been for Tolkien's
mhm.
promotion.
You touched on myth, and I want to sort of loop back to northernness because it's something that
Yeah.
I didn't know of before looking into the Inklings. And I wonder if you could get into, I guess, like we're more used to Greek mythology, I think, in general. So the
Mhm.
idea of northernness is, I found fascinating in that different cultures of mythology, I suppose. Maybe that's what I mean.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I'd be happy to speak to that a bit. Stephen, do you want to start off on that or?
Well, I'll just say that I think if you look at Lewis's work and Tolkien, both of them, when they talk about their development, there was something about the idea of the North itself that called to them, that both of them very deeply. And I think that they encountered that, of course, when they were reading the mythologies of the North. But it had that same effect, and I think it still does in a funny way. You could look at something like the Spell of the Yukon, or and it's there is this kind of spell of the North that was cast on them. And yes, Tolkien particularly, I would say, was formed by that very, very deeply, and that works itself out right through the Lord of the Rings and the rest of it. Yeah.
Yeah, think of it as the Northern Lights, as you're saying. That's brilliant. Um,
Mhm.
so as Canadians, we should kind of,
Yeah.
jump on that. But yeah, so they both really loved a Northern mythology. It's not to say that they're limited to that. They totally
Mhm.
are looking at, Mediterranean mythology and so on. The thing with Northernness does get us very quickly into this whole question, was Tolkien racist? Was, Lewis racist? Like they just love their Northern European and Western European heritage. And that I would argue, no, they were not. And so when some people say, "Oh, Tolkien is racist because he's always talking about being, Northern and Western European," I would say, well, first of all, that's just simply a descriptive term, not a pejorative term. Yeah, they're European and they happen to be Northwestern European and they love their geo-historical place. But some of the things to note in that is that they're not equating. So Tolkien was very outspoken on this in his letters. Not that he wrote long essays about it, but that northernness is not a sacred direction for Tolkien. W.H. Auden thought it was, and Tolkien's like, no, northernness is actually associated with evil, with the seed of the devil. So when we're talking about northernness, northern mythology, we have to be very careful with that. And I think that if we just get a sense of their love for northern mythology, that whole sense of Sehnsucht, that longing for the other, that of course we get in other mythologies, I think that kind of steers us correctly away from falling off the wagon. Um, yeah.
Well, if I could add something to that, I mean, if you look at Lewis's own mythology, I mean, there was Arabic mythology in the Witch and the Wardrobe. You can see that as well. But his best book, I think, I would still argue that Lewis's best book really develops Greek mythology, and it's Till We Have Faces, which is based on the Cupid Psyche myth, or you know. But
Yeah.
and I think it's by far his best. But I do think his heart, it was first stirred by the North. For what I mean, I must say, I lived up in Yellowknife, I worked up in Whitehorse, and I know what that's like. It's when you get there, you wonder if you've missed it sometimes, but it always seems to be a bit beyond. But it's that idea of it's a liminal place. I mean, George MacDonald does the same thing at the back
Mm.
of the North Wind, where there is this kind of place that like from which all goodness is. It's this place beyond, it's really beyond the sublunary existence that's driven by fortune. But anyway, George MacDonald had a little bit of that too, I would say, in at the back of the North Wind. So
Yeah, I agree with that.
yeah.
It makes me think about the feeling that my friends from Prince Edward Island or Newfoundland, Labrador have about the call to go home or the call to
Mm-hmm.
return to where they were born. Like you always have a pull to your island,
Yeah.
and I think that there's sort of a general thought of that that pull to oneness, that pull to wholeness. Talking about oneness and wholeness, uh, and jump. There's all these nuggets that are flying around, and love it. That Barfield and Lewis disagreed.
Oh,
Interesting, but but
Yes.
C.S. Lewis dedicates The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe to Lucy Barfield,
Mhm.
and Voyage of the Dawn Treader to Geoffrey, to his uh, grandson. Is that correct? So how does that? How do you go to dedicating this novel to somebody that you're at odds with?
dear.
Well, because you're friends and because you're not entirely at odds. Stephen, do you want to respond to that? And maybe I'll add on to it.
Sure. I, I I find his relationship with Owen Barfield's fascinating. They met at Oxford as undergraduates, and they seem to have gotten along. Owen Barfield became an anthroposophist in the year that he got married. I think that was 1926. Barfield's wife was very unhappy with this development. This is the first year they're married, and she considered Lewis to be his only normal friend. So she goes to Lewis and she asks him to intervene, or at least to intercede, and like to try to talk him out of his interest in this. Anyway, they entered into what's known as the Great War, and where they're really essentially debating its imagination is at the heart of their disagreement, and what imagination can bring us. And this goes on and on forever and ever. But anyway, there's some very famous quotations. Lewis says of Barfield, he says he's read all the right books and gotten the wrong thing out of every one of them. It says it's like he spoke your language but mispronounced everything. But on the other hand, he had tremendous respect. He often speaks of Barfield's towering genius. He clearly considered Barfield to be the one towering intellect of the group. And you're right, he appreciated they're all, but Monica's right. I mean, she can speak to friendship. We need more of that today. People who can really disagree and yet retain this fundamental loyalty to each other as friends in this respect.
Well, that's why, Warren, you have both of us talking with you. The old, iron sharpens iron, and being, unafraid to disagree and unafraid to
Mm.
say at the end of the day or at the end of every hour and the end of each day, I could be wrong.
Mhm.
But at the same time, this is why, I'm arguing that way. And
Mhm.
essentially, the Great War, uh, has to do with what is it? Is it reason or imagination that leads us to truth? And Barfield, well, it's imagination, and Lewis is like it's reason. But I think they're also, at some sense, I don't know, I wonder if they're kind of talking about different things or talking, past each other because of the anthroposophy. So Lewis is saying, imagine the imaginative man in me was always older and consistent. And of course, Lewis
Mm.
also describes himself as a rationalist, in the sense that he believes in the validity of reason. We're made in the image of God, and he's trained in philosophy. So that line that's often associated with their friendship and disagreeing is that, how does it go? Opposition is the sign of true friendship.
Opposition is true friendship. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sort of makes me think of of the idea we're the Shaw Festival. So there's this idea that when you come here, it's okay that you don't really connect with everything 100%,
Mhm.
that there are certain part of the nature of being a festival, and this is what our artistic director, Tim Carroll, says, that there are some things that you're really going to take to, and there are some things that you might not take to as much. But the
Mhm.
nature of it is the variety of it, is that, and the interest is that duality of I really respond to this, I don't respond to this as much. Why?
Mhm.
What's in that? It,
Mhm.
I'm interested in imagination, especially because we use it a lot in our world in theater in terms
Mhm.
of world building. So I wonder
Mhm.
if what your thoughts are on that in terms of imagination and world building. I mean, especially in the fantasy genre, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, imagination, it's kind of a base definition, is the ability to think otherwise, to think outside the box. In English Lit, I mean, we've got this long tradition of imagination. We've got Wordsworth so famously having said that imagination is reason exalted. So we tend to kind of divide reason, imagination, but even with that, we've got from older understandings, which Lewis also keeps talking about, we've got discursive reason, we've got intuitive reason. So there's something about imagination, intuition that is linked, and yeah, it's a huge, huge question, and
Mhm.
I'm so glad that we have a chance to talk a little bit about it.
Mhm. I'd like to say something about the its relationship to world building. Now, it's quite interesting if you look at the different members of the Inklings and where their focus of imagination is. Uh, so with Tolkien, I'd argue that essentially his imagination, that he uses his imagination to recreate the ethos of this northern mythology that we're talking about. He really takes us back to an older time in a particular area, right? And I think the great power of the Lord of the Rings comes from the how comprehensive and informed that imagination is. It's very, very powerful. Lewis Lewis, I would say, uses imagination to build. So Tolkien called that, by the way, and he links it to the idea of, as Monica was saying, human beings as created in the image of God. And because they're in the image of God, they're secondary creators. So for Tolkien, one uses imagination to create secondary worlds. Lewis, I think, subscribed to that too, in a way. And he creates these secondary worlds that are somehow linked to ours, but they're in another dimension, as it were. And that's kind of interesting, but he uses imagination to build those worlds. Now, I would argue that for Lewis, there's a lot more Plato in those other worlds, that he's using his imagination to develop these worlds according to certain kinds of timeless patterns. Now, what's interesting, if we go now to Owen Barfield and Charles Williams, Barfield says that imagination is going to be the key, not to the past as it is with Tolkien, but to the future, which is fascinating. So that we're going to need imagination to break out of the kind of trap of modernity and material and reductive materialism and so forth. Charles Williams, on the other hand, he does something that none of the other ones do, and that is to use imagination to show us what our world is here and now. He doesn't build an older world. He doesn't build an alternative world. He doesn't talk about a future world. He allows us to look around, and he changes our view of our current world. So he's world expanding. But imagination is essentially creation, and it's linked to the creative impulse. Dorothy Sayers, another friend of the Inklings, very important woman, actually wrote she wrote quite a few drama, and I think her drama was quite powerful. She argued too that it was essentially in human creativity that humans were most like God in their creativity and their use of imagination. So it was very important. It was essential to the Inklings. It's right. It's a perfect question because it's right at the heart of things. Yeah.
It makes me think of what we were talking about a week ago when we were sort of catching up and talking about
Mm-hmm.
this session. And I wonder if you could get into supposal. It's when we were talking about it, I sort of equated it to theater and the magical what if that we use in theater. And it was nice. It was interesting to see the parallels there.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, so Lewis used the word supposal because of the idea that he's not writing allegory, and Tolkien is very allergic to the term allegory, and it's probably because in that time frame, at that part of the 20th century, it's not popular. Allegory, not popular. And yet Tolkien wrote one of the, super, very memorable allegories, Leaf by Niggle.
Mhm.
But so their concern is that we're not reducing their creative work on a one-to-one correspondence, like Aslan equals Christ. Well, yeah, he's a Christ figure. And then we do see various Christ figures, maybe not as obvious in Tolkien because he's writing about, he's writing about the pagan past. This is
Mhm.
pre-incarnation, so he gets off the hook that way. I always think. But yeah, supposal is suppose what would the Christ figure, look like in this imaginary world?
Hmm.
Hmm.
Narnia.
Yeah, I'm thinking that one thing we didn't speak about, and I think it's one of the reasons that they all had an inclination to suppose otherwise, is because I would think that one of the things that really unifies the Inklings themselves was a profound dissatisfaction with modernity.
Mhm.
Every one of them really rejected the idea of a kind of reductive materialist world. And I think that their supposals were really, it wasn't to get away from reality. I think this is a key point for me, and I would say the same about theater. Good theater, the best theater, should be bringing us closer to reality rather than farther away from it. And I think that the supposals that are going on are ways of reimagining or rethinking about things that will get us out of the trap that I think all the Inklings sense that we were really stuck.
Mhm.
And they were theists. And I think, I mean, what is the heart of the scientific revolution? It's it's a movement to strip the qualitative out of our descriptions of the world, to allow us a purely quantitative approach to reality that allows us to describe and manipulate reality mathematically, but it has no qualia, no quality. And it's that loss of the qualitative, I think, that creates the disaster. It is strictly speaking meaningless. It leaves us with a meaningless world. And I guess there's a couple of ways you can approach that. You can say, well, if in fact the world is like that, then why not pretend that it has meaning?
Mhm.
But I think that what the Inklings are doing is they're saying, let's suppose, however, that we've lost the plot and that we've lost our ability to see. And these supposals, I see them, again, imagination as a way of recovering, recreating this
Exactly.
qualitative. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
recovery, um, consolation, eucatastrophe. Tolkien talked
Mhm.
about all that. I absolutely agree, and it's lovely how you
Yeah.
said that, Stephen. They're all pushing back on um, philosophical materialism, like this, empiricism. What we can measure is all there is. So they're actually wanting to um, entice readers with the possibility that the transcendent is, yeah, the ultimate reality, and that's why the world that we live in has intrinsic meaning.
Mm.
It's making me think of um, or what we say in arts education. Don't ask them what they think. Ask them what they felt.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Sort
well,
of.
fair enough.
Uh, we're not at the Q&A portion, but it sort of like has naturally come up. There's Pragna is wondering if you might speak about the influence Barfield had on C.S. Lewis and his return to Christianity.
Oh, okay. If Monica, I'm just going to say he had zero influence on that, but Monica can take it away.
Let's
But
go.
it's a
I
good question.
recently read, if I'm understanding the question right, that the argument with Barfield really perfected Lewis's perfected is not maybe the word I want to use, but anyway, really increased his already amazing ability to argue. And so his whole trajectory into, apologetics, which was one aspect of Lewis, of course. Yeah, without Barfield, would he have been as good? No, essentially no.
It's interesting. Do you know what Barfield said about that? He said, Lewis taught me how to think. And then Barfield said, but I taught Lewis what to think. And I don't think he's quite right, but it's the big advantage of living longer than all your friends, because you can write about them when they're dead and they can't say anything. They actually can't respond. But no, I think there were other people who were more important to Lewis. I think Tolkien was important for Lewis's return, and maybe Hugo Dyson. Who were the people? There's that famous midnight walk in the gardens.
It was Hugo Dyson.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So Hugo Dyson and Tolkien, in terms of, to pick up on what you were saying about influence on Lewis, Charles
Mhm.
Williams, very major influence. And perhaps there was something of jealousy in that too on the part of Tolkien. It's not really nice to talk about people's sins, but then we do. Oh dear. But the idea that well, part of the reason I think why Tolkien was wary of Williams is because of Williams', very intimate knowledge of the occult through his Order of the Golden Dawn. Not that he was practicing the occult, that's a whole other topic. But anyway, the idea of the Arthurian myth and so on. It has been said that hideous strength is a Williams novel written by Tolkien, Lewis. I don't think that's entirely fair, but it's been something people talk about.
But in terms of conversion, about the question of conversion, if anything, Lewis was expended in the Great War a huge amount of energy trying to talk Barfield out of his anthroposophy. That's really what happened, and there was no talking Barfield out of his anthroposophy. I had the privilege of being able to interview Barfield when he was in his late 80s. He lived to be almost 100. And he even then I asked him about Rudolf Steiner, who was, the founder of anthroposophy. And Barfield said, no, this guy's the real deal. And his Owen Barfield's grandson, who's also called Owen, it's the same thing. He was absolutely convinced of anthroposophy. And I don't, yes, in terms of Lewis's faith, I think it had nothing to do really with it. If anything, as Monica says, it probably sharpened his understanding of his own position better.
I'm wondering if, for those of us who haven't encountered the word anthroposophy, if you could sort of explain what that is.
Oh my goodness.
That's a slippery term.
Well,
I'd be happy to pass that to Stephen. I always find myself somewhat thinking I understand, and then I'm confused again.
well, okay. In the 19th century in particular, throughout Europe particularly, there was a strong movement. I'd say it's like the Romantic movement, but it took a sort of occult turn. It was against this idea of materialism, basically scientism. And so there were many occult orders or mystical orders. Madame Blavatsky's The Theosophical Society, I believe. Rudolf Steiner was a German. He was a PhD guy. He'd studied Goethe's theories of, I think, color to get his PhD. So he was a very smart academic. He became involved in the Theosophical Society, which means God wisdom, theosophy. And his first lecture as president of the organization was on anthroposophy, which is man wisdom. So what anthroposophists, is a bit tricky, but essentially an anthroposophist like Barfield would argue that there is a direct link between human consciousness and phenomena, that you do not have any phenomena without human consciousness. Okay, that's kind of important. So there was never a time on the earth when there was no human consciousness. If there was an earth at all, there was some form of human consciousness. Now, anthroposophists believe that spirit predates matter, and that matter comes out of a spiritual background. So for them, spirit is fundamental, consciousness is fundamental, matter comes later. And so it's exactly, so they sort of stand the Darwinian and neo-Darwinian view of where consciousness comes from. They just turn it inside out. And anyway, I don't know if that helps, but it's Steiner was seen as, this is Rudolf Steiner, was seen as a not so much a human being by anthroposophists as a kind of natural phenomena. They see him as an initiate that comes along once every 1,000 years in human consciousness development. So basically, Steiner claimed to have seen a lot of things through his mystical experience of the etheric plane and other things like this that were unverifiable and that his disciples believed or didn't believe. But I asked Barfield about that directly, and I said, so you really think he's the guy? And yeah, he said, yep. But I have to explain too, Barfield just wasn't, I mean, it seems so odd to us to go that way. But Barfield's own philological studies that he wrote in his undergraduate, this is the study of language, right? In his undergraduate degree that became a book called Poetic Diction, Barfield had come to a lot of the conclusions that the anthroposophists did through his own studies before reading anthroposophy, so that when he ran into Steiner, it seemed like this was the development, the direction that things should go. So in fact, he has a book called Romanticism Comes of Age, where he argues, this is Barfield, where he argues that the whole Romantic movement should have ended up or gone in the direction of anthroposophy. And he said that all of the Romantic movements, German Romantics, Wordsworth, Coleridge, they all ended up in kind of a puerile adolescence because they didn't develop an intellectual system to go along with it, which is what Steiner had done. So it's not like Barfield just sort of, he sort of consulted his lucky mood astrology watch and decided to become an anthroposophist today. It was, it was development of his intellectual interests, but you can see why Barfield's wife would have wanted to enlist Lewis.
Mm-hmm. And also, just to add on, a great resource a great place to start reading more about Barfield is Owen Barfield Jr., his grandson, the website. Mm-hmm. So owenbarfield.org. You can read, essays, fairy tales. It's a great resource that Owen Barfield Jr. continues to update.
Mm-hmm.
We have questions now. The first one is from Eric, who's a professor at Humber, one of our friends, and a Tolkien fan. And he asks, is some of the critique of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe linked to Tolkien's theories on the role of fairy tale and seeing it too much as allegory rather than his notions of subcreation?
I'll leave this to Monica.
So, Lewis very much thought, he used the term as subcreation, and of course Tolkien and Lewis are always talking to each other. So for example, his essay Christianity and Literature, he's talking about that as well. This is subcreation. Basically, I would say Lewis, like the Mozart guy, anyway, it just kind of pours out. He's very playful. He feels, he's got the artistic license to do all kinds of things from what he has learned, as opposed to Tolkien, the self-described pedant. No, this is what a faun is. I cannot really change that. So though some Tolkien scholars say that, well, he actually did a few things too. I think the main thing with the difference between Narnia and, well, not the main thing, but in terms of this question, between what Lewis achieved in Narnia and what Tolkien achieved in Lord of the Rings is that the Christianity is fairly evident in Chronicles of Narnia, and it is not so evident, or you can ignore, if you want to, the Christianity of Lord of the Rings. So when pushed on the question, so Tolkien, a writer writing to Tolkien saying, there seems to be this something holiness, something. And Tolkien says, yeah, basically this book is not about yeah, it's about freedom, but it's essentially about God's sole right to honor. So it is essentially a religious, a Catholic work. But then, of course, it's set in the pagan past, pre-incarnation. So I always say Tolkien gets off the hook, in terms of Lewis is wanting to portray what the incarnation would look like, especially feel like. And with Tolkien, it's subtle.
I'm thinking about the question too, and I'm wondering if the questioner was asking about Tolkien seems to imply on fairy stories, I believe that's what it is, that that really there is in the world essentially one fundamental story, and that story is a story that involves this eucatastrophe, this happy turn at the end that we can see either in the incarnation or the resurrection. And that's an interesting question. Did Lewis depart from that, from the one story? And I think that no, I don't think he did in that sense. I think that Lewis stuck pretty close to the story that he thought was the story that all stories relate to. But perhaps it was this idea of not, because I think, as I recall, Tolkien in that essay uses an analogy of making a soup. And he seems to imply that certain flavors can go into the soup and other flavors shouldn't. Maybe it was really a chef's objection, and that he didn't think that some of the flavors that Lewis was putting in were going to work well in the soup, that was going to produce that. But, and I suspect it was that, that because, I think Lewis is telling really the same story that Tolkien is when it comes right down to it.
Yeah, and I agree. Thank you, Stephen. And Tolkien, when he speaks of eucatastrophes in that essay on fairy stories, he speaks about glimpses of the world beyond the
Yes.
ultimate.
Yeah.
And so he's giving more subtle glimpses in his legendarium. But he's speaking to the one story. And Lewis has in Narnia the glimpses are more obvious, whereas in something like Stephen, you were referring to Till We Have Faces, which yeah, you say it's his best work, and
He thought it was.
he's exactly Lewis thought it was his best work,
Yeah.
and so he's imagining essentially the story in the pagan past.
Yeah.
What does that? Yeah, what is that like?
We had another question come to us, and it sort of, I think, ties into the talking we've had of Lewis and Tolkien. What of lesser known inklings can be seen in the more well-known inklings?
What of the lesser?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Yeah.
I was distracted by the chat, I will say.
What of lesser known inklings can be seen in the more well-known inklings?
Oh, okay. Monica's already answered one of those. People argue that really in That Hideous Strength, that's really influenced tremendously by Charles Williams. So you can see that. And I think that's the most obvious example. But yeah, I do think that the lesser known, I think that in terms of the work, I don't think there's all that many works where, okay, actually, I can give you an answer from one of the slightly known inklings to one of the inklings' friends that we don't know anything about. Dorothy Sayers, who was a friend, really was she was one of the first women to get a degree from Oxford. An absolutely brilliant woman. She ended up translating the Divine Comedy, but she ended up learning Italian because of Charles Williams. She was so impressed with reading his work, The Figure of Beatrice, that she sort of stopped what she was doing, which was, she was involved in playwriting, and she spent the last years of her life translating Dante. And that was partly Williams' influence. It was almost, well, she says she did. She said she only started it because of Williams.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really good. And speaking of Williams, he was so impressed with Lewis's um, academic book, The Allegory of Love, and Lewis with The Place of the Lion, kind of
Yeah.
Place of the Lion. Yeah, so their friendship beginning that way. I would like to actually add on to the question by putting out the um, uh, hypothesis that we really wouldn't have had the Lewis that we have had he not been so heavily influenced by George MacDonald.
Yep.
And he did say that he was always quoting MacDonald. And I know that for myself, the more I've read of MacDonald, the more I'm like, yeah, Lewis is right. Here we have MacDonald again. Hmm.
Mhm.
We were, it seemed that the discussion on northernness really piqued interest of the people in the Zoom. We had two questions about northernness. Here they both are, and we can tackle it together perhaps. Curious if the elves leaving Middle Earth to go to Arda was inspired by the love of northernness. Question two, if northernness is a focus, did the Inklings include any Inuit or Sami culture?
Huh.
I saw that second question come in, and I wasn't sure that I could answer that very well, but this isn't a very good answer to that question. But on the other hand, there is I think, a clear sense of Indigenous peoples in both Lewis's and Tolkien's consciousness. And I will, as much as they both loved their European homeland, they were not uncritical of imperialism. And in Out of the Silent Planet, for example, Lewis cites, ironically, the English rifle used by the bad guys as, yeah, a sign of English civilization. And of course, that's a reductive statement because he greatly honors his, English, Irish, Anglo background. But there is a sensitivity to Indigenous peoples. And this, I think, is very important when we look at the critique of Calormen, the Calormen peoples, because some people say, "Oh my goodness, he's so racist. The darker skinned people are the evil ones," which is, I think, a total misreading, because what we have is an evil empire which suppresses the majority of the people, and we've got good and evil everywhere, regardless of skin color. So I don't know if that is a super helpful answer, but it is a really important question.
I'd like to address the first one, the idea of the elves leaving and this idea of northernness. I think that for me, Monica mentioned the German word Sehnsucht, which is really at the heart of Lewis's. It's this idea of this longing that just can't be satisfied in this world. And I think that the idea of northernness is tied to Sehnsucht, as you were saying. But I think the elves leaving, it just pushes that Sehnsucht farther. It's like you're not, if you go there, the elves aren't there anymore. The elves are now somewhere else. And there is this longing for whatever, even like the elves leaving is so, it's Sehnsucht. It's not even, it's much stronger than melancholy. It's this idea that we've been abandoned. They are somewhere else. Maybe we can get to where they're going, but that the world is the poorer without the elves. And so I do think that it was that northernness that promised something, right?
Mhm.
But now the elves have gone and the promise has been deferred.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
kind of
that's
the way I
great.
see that.
Yeah, that's really good. So this whole idea of nature being enchanted, even
Mm,
Lucy Montgomery says the elves are gone.
yeah.
So the idea of Sehnsucht, that you would rather have the pain that comes with the
Yeah.
romantic longing of the thing that you long for, this desire. You would rather see the absence, but also find glimpses of it in this world. And then, of course, as Christians, Lewis and Tolkien, well, we know where that's leading us to because it actually is the ultimate reality. So we would rather recognize ourselves as pilgrims on this path. And the northernness has helped us to feel that.
Hmm. Mm. It's
I don't
good.
know why, but it makes me think of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the famous photograph where he so wanted to believe in fairies that he
Uh,
said, "Fairies are real. Here's a photo. Here's the evidence."
well, do you know who David Bentley Hart is?
No.
Okay, David Bentley Hart he's an Eastern Orthodox theologian. He's a very fine philosopher as well. He does a lot of work on consciousness. He's written many books. He's always the smartest guy in the room. Anyway, one there was this writer, and I heard her interviewed who was a friend of his, and she says what drew him to Hart was Hart believed in fairies. He took them very seriously. So there you go. It I always thought that was rather charming too, but I don't know, and I don't think he's pulling our leg. I think he meant that whatever fairies represented, that they're still accessible, that they're still here, and that they're real, and that so Hart writes his own fiction, and in this fiction there are these creatures, and but Hart didn't see it as a imagining it or as a escape from reality, but again as going deeper into our reality as it is. So
Yeah.
Hart talks about that.
And we could connect that with what the other Inklings mentor. So we've talked about George MacDonald, but G.K. Chesterton
Uh-huh.
talked about a fairy tale and the idea that it's actually more rational than so-called realism. Because again, this very thing you were talking about, Stephen, that it points to well, the supernatural, and gives us a sense of, well, moral law
Mm-hmm.
and all that. So to take fairy tale seriously, and this is so important because Tolkien, and Lewis quotes him, that we have this historical accident that fairy tales were relegated to the nursery to children, meaning they're not important. And so I find that really interesting, and I'm wondering to what extent that's limited to the British Isles, because from my own cultural background, my understanding is actually so on the continent, German and Eastern Europe and so on, that people actually take fairy tales very seriously. Like adults will go to fairy tale theater, and this is about us, and this is about reality.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
We
Maybe it is a. Sorry, go ahead, Warren.
no. You finish your thought, please.
No, I agree. I agree with Monica. I think that one of the reasons it went to the nursery was not just because it wasn't important, but the implication was that you'll grow out of them when you become a real adult. So we get someone like Charles Taylor, the great Canadian political philosopher, who says the story that modernity's been telling, he calls it the subtraction narrative. And he says that through time, what's been happening, this is the view that contemporary modernists have, is that we've been stripping away the accretions of illusion, and now we're down to the hard facts. Charles Taylor says that's simply wrong. That whatever we've stripped down to, we haven't got down to reality, whatever we think that is. But the implication, and I think it is a particularly British thing, maybe even a Scottish thing too. If you think about the Scottish Enlightenment and people like David Hume, that there was this sense that they were realists, that they knew what reality was. We don't need to pretend, and that fairy tales are really a kind of pretense for those who can't cope with reality as it is. Maybe that's true too of partly of the French Revolution and the spirit that came out of that with the philosophes and so forth. But it probably, I think Monica's right, it probably is a kind of sensibility that is restricted in some ways. There are lots of places in the world today that take, as Monica says, fairy tales quite seriously.
Yeah, and maybe it's true that the German, the Enlightenment, there is similarly that rejection of fairy tale.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, my experience of the culture on the continent, which is limited because I
Mm-hmm.
am Canadian born, but I don't know, it seems to me that many, many people, like the fairy tales, are very much part of their consciousness in ways that I think are very intelligent, actually, and emotionally connected.
Mm-hmm.
So I could be wrong. It's my analysis.
I see the clock, and I just want to make sure we get to our last question because we are at the Shaw Festival producing a new adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe this year. So I'm wondering from you both, what is one thing about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe you would want people to know before going to see the show?
I'll just say one thing and then I'll hand it over to Monica. I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as Lewis's fictional exploration of the therapeutic power of imagination. I see the wardrobe itself as a symbol of imagination, that we have people who need healing. Lucy needs to grow up a little bit, but Edmund is in trouble. He goes through the wardrobe, and in that world, that alternate world, that imaginary world, he discovers things about himself. And because of those discoveries, he is able to be cured. He has to come back to reality. So it's just that. It's an exploration for me about imagination. It's what happens in imagination as experienced by Edmund. Monica.
Ah, that was brilliant. So I would say, suspend your disbelief. Lewis was really hoping that children and adults would not kind of connect all the dots to the Christian dogma, the Christian narrative that they would experience. So past the watchful dragons. So if we have watchful dragons that say, "Oh no, Christianity, don't go there," just try to be open to what Lewis is wanting us to feel. And there's something else with that. But essentially, maybe, yeah, this is something. So kind of like what Stephen was saying, let the story work on you. What sort of things does the story draw out in you? And in a sense, of course, we maybe not want to, but we typically should connect maybe at some level with all the characters, including the witch. When are we like the witch? When are we like Edmund? Like all the time. And then when are we like Lucy? Like, can we be like that? And what it is about Lucy that enables her to have this openness to wonder. So maybe I can end on that point. Openness to wonder. I actually have a sub point. Sorry. But George MacDonald is saying, fairy tales are supposed to draw things out in you. And so don't try to reduce them. And they're supposed to wake things up in you. So it's not like Lewis is telling you things. It's like things that you know. He is working. The beauty of the art is that it awakens us to things that we haven't maybe consciously thought of.
Okay. May I add one thing, Warren? I just got thinking about this. I don't think it's a matter of suspending our disbelief. I think that what we need to do is suspend our beliefs. Okay. Barfield said that we need to practice what he called unthinking, that we need to try to strip away all the beliefs and assumptions that get in the way of our experiencing something new. And Monica's right. It's that idea of really being open to new patterns. And yeah, I always identified with Edmund. I thought, he was my guy.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, when Coleridge said suspend your disbelief, it's the whole thing about pushing back on philosophical materialism.
Exactly.
So just different language for the same thing.
Yep.
Ask them what they thought, what they felt, not what they thought.
There you go.
Wow. Monica, Stephen, you were both so wonderful, so easy to talk to. And I knew that we would, an hour would just fly by. So I want to say thank you. Thank you both so much. It's just been a wonderful time spent with you. If everybody in the Zoom room, you're interested in following the Inklings, please do follow the work of the Inklings Institute of Canada. They are easily found online, and we've been talking with the co-founders, co-directors this whole time. So if you're interested in these two people, you'll be interested in their work. Please do stay on the Zoom if you're interested in a sneak peek into The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, our digital study guide. And please do come and join us in person and go beyond the stage with us at the Shaw Festival. And if you want to learn more, you go to shawfest.com/beyond. Monica, Stephen, thank you so much.
And thank you.
Thank you so much.